A violent world war produced strong cultural reactions from writers, painters, and poets whose lives had been touched by 4 years of brutality. Intellectual life in Western Europe and North America evolved significantly during the 1920s and 1930s. Literature, art, and film reflected a world where traditional institutions and sources of authority were deeply questioned. In this lesson, we're going to cover some of the literary and artistic trends that emerged from the trauma and hardships of the Great War. All Quiet on the Western Front is one of the most culturally significant novels based on the personal experience of a Great War veteran. This novel was written by Erich Maria Remarque, a veteran of Germany's forces on the Western Front. Published in January of 1929, All Quiet on the Western Front follows the life of a young soldier who witnesses violent deaths and gruesome suffering in the war trenches. Remarque's novel was an example of realism, a literary and artistic style that confronted the realities of life as experienced by common people. Realism was a direct confrontation of life's less pleasant realities. In post-war Germany, realism affected literature just as much as art did. One specific post-war German movement of realist art was the Neue Sachlichkeit school. Neue Sachlichkeit translates as New Objectivity. New Objectivity was an artistic style that sought to convey the realities of life as observed by the artist. Prominent German New Objectivist artists include Otto Dix and George Grosz. Otto Dix enlisted in the German army in 1915 and survived the Battle of the Somme before being transferred to the Eastern Front. After the war, he studied art and produced a number of pieces that illustrated the traumas he experienced as a soldier. The 1920s was also a time when a genre of art called Surrealism became popular. Surrealism is an artistic movement that juxtaposed realistic images with distorted ones that emphasize the nature of the former. As part of the surrealist element, Neue Sachlichkeit George Grosz also tapped into his experiences to express his views on German nationalism. Grosz was discharged from the German army in 1915 and became an anti-government and anti-war figure. After the war, his artwork generally reflected his disdain for the blind obedience and false patriotism. The Surrealist movement, known as Dadaism, took hold in Switzerland around 1916 and continued up through the 1920s and 1930s. Dadaist artists based their works on irrational absurdity and chaos, challenging conventional norms of harmony and symmetry in art. The Dada movement became popular in the German-speaking Swiss city of Zurich, and its style was adopted by artists in Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States. Many Dadaist works were forms of social commentary, critiquing authority, social hierarchy, government tyranny, and the destructive role of machinery, such as weapons and tanks in human life. In France, the Spanish-born artist Pablo Picasso avoided army service during the Great War, but his art was still influenced by the war's devastation. Picasso became one of the post-war period's most prominent surrealist artists, and much of his art was Cubist. Cubism uses interlocking planes and geometric shapes to create images, which are often arranged in a collage format. His work into the 1930s reflected the rise of authoritarian governments in Europe as well as the devastation brought by the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. American prosperity during the 1920s produced a consumer culture as the U.S. took its place as the world's leading economy. While optimism over American wealth and power grew in post-war United States, the shadows of war and disdain with consumerism contributed to the growth of realist literature. Senior American author Gertrude Stein remarked that those who had survived the Great War were a lost generation. This term came to define the disillusionment experienced by those whose formative years were shaped by the war. Notable American war veteran Ernest Hemingway reflected on his experiences in works of literature like Death in the Afternoon. Ernest Hemingway was a young writer who was mentored by Gertrude Stein and acted as a medic during the Great War. Hemingway arrived in Italy as a Red Cross ambulance driver in the summer of 1918, witnessing the last months of combat. Although Death in the Afternoon is a book about bullfighting in Spain, it functioned as a metaphor for the war and the precarity of life. Hemingway's 1926 work, The Sun Also Rises, used the term lost generation as the novel's epigraph. The Sun Also Rises tells the story of British and American expatriates in Paris who travel around France and into Spain, a tale that mirrored Hemingway's own post-war life as a disenchanted expatriate in 1920s Paris. American author F. Scott Fitzgerald observed the shallow materialism that pervaded America during the 1920s, producing his famous work, The Great Gatsby. In The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald crafted a character who became the living embodiment of the American dream, who ends up dying under tragic circumstances as he flirted with life as a member of the nation's moneyed elite. African-American writers like Langston Hughes speculated on the continued repression of black people even after many had served their country in the military and the war industries. The 1920s was America's era of prohibition, or nationwide ban on the production and sale of alcohol. Organized crime syndicates made their fortunes as bootleggers or criminals who trafficked and sold illegal alcohol. Prohibition gave rise to underground speakeasies, which were semi-secret nightclubs where liquor was served. While some alcohol was smuggled in from Canada, Mexico, Europe, and the Caribbean, many poorer Americans turned to making their own liquor, often in unsanitary conditions. Illnesses and death from homemade alcohol became a persistent problem during the Prohibition era, with reports of fatalities from bathtub gin and moonshine dotting newspaper headlines. The 1920s was a decade that reflected a changed world. Traditional forms of art and literature were transformed by the spirit of post-war anxiety and disillusionment. Let's review some key terms from this lesson on cultural reactions to the Great War. Which of these historical personalities was a German Great War veteran who became known in the 1920s for his realist paintings? A. Pablo Picasso, B. Otto Dix, C. Erich Maria Remarque, D. Gertrude Stein. The answer is B. Otto Dix.